Hello, I'm Jonasz Rewiński, and you're watching Break the Fake. They make them, we break them, and tell you everything you need to know. Well, isn't this just a classic case of logistical brilliance from the Russian military? You've got Z-bloggers, or Z-bloggers, depending on how you want to pronounce it, but basically Kremlin mouthpieces. Just like, for example, Yegor Guzienko, also known as 13th, and they're openly admitting that Russian soldiers are being sent into battle with, wait for it, not enough ammunition. You know, just a minor detail when you're in the middle of a war, right? Apparently, the strikes on Russian ammunition depots by Ukraine are taking their toll. But instead of addressing the problem, the solution seems to be, let's just keep sending the soldiers in anyway. It's almost like the Russian strategy now involves hoping the enemy runs out of ammo first, just without any evidence to suggest that might actually happen.
Ребята, и еще хотелось бы поднять очень важный вопрос снарядного голода в войсках. Это не, скажем так, не как-то локально там где-то, да, а вот это сейчас ощущается на разных направлениях и набирает это нездоровую тенденцию опять по всяким преступным лимитам, по которым, на рыбалку можно чисто съездить, а не там штурмовать там какие-нибудь населенники. То есть штурмовать идите, артиллерийского огня хуй. Так же не должно быть, ребята. Причем заводы работают каждый день. Да, склады хохлы уничтожают, мы все видим, большие, как вот в Тихорецке пылало там 3 суток, там, или сколько там взрывалось, людей эвакуировали. И также другие склады и арсеналы, которые хохлы уничтожают. Это все, конечно, очень нехорошо и плохо. Но заводы же работают. Куда идут эти боеприпасы? Почему их мало войск?
At this rate, it won't be long before they are down to throwing rocks and sticks, all while declaring they are still on track to meet their quote-unquote liberation goals. It is almost impressive how far they will go to pretend everything is under control, especially since now there is no Yevgeny Prigozhin to shout at the Russian top brass for not providing any munitions. You remember that? Shoigu, Gerasimov. By the way, that was one of the little steps that Yevgeny Prigozhin took towards his own undoing. Are the others learning his lesson? Well, not necessarily. I mean, if you complain, perhaps not too loudly, you might just get away with it. Perhaps. The question of NATO's response time in the event of an attack is one that always stirs up interest and perhaps a bit of anxiety. After all, NATO is often described as the security umbrella that shields Western Europe and other parts of the world. But what happens when the storm finally hits? How quickly will NATO respond if a member state, say Poland, is attacked? Well, to break it down, experts, both Polish and American, emphasize one key point. NATO's strength is only as powerful as its individual members. Poland, for example, must be capable of defending itself in the immediate aftermath of a potential attack, at least until NATO forces can be fully mobilized. So in the first hour, you would see intelligence networks buzzing, assessing the scale and source of the attack. National forces would be on high alert, especially in a country like Poland, which has been preparing for a contingency like this extensively. Within a day, NATO's Article 5 could be invoked, which means the alliance would declare that an attack on one of its members is an attack on all. But here's the kicker. How long will it take before boots from other countries are actually on the ground? Maybe a week or more, depending on logistics, mobilization, and the exact nature of the conflict. The reality is, no one expects NATO forces to flood in immediately. Poland, like any NATO member, needs to be prepared to hold its ground, perhaps for days, even weeks, before reinforcements arrive in full force. This is why Poland is arming itself to the teeth. This is deterrence 101, really. And let me tell you one thing. If Russia has issues with a few HIMARS launchers in Ukraine, and let's face it, it does, then it would really, really hate facing a country that's ordered hundreds of both HIMARS and their South Korean equivalents. That's Poland to you. Meanwhile, Russia's state propaganda machine absolutely loves playing with the idea of confronting NATO. Moscow's leading TV hosts, aka Kremlin Comedy Central, have already scripted attacks on Poland into their nightly talk shows, whipping up anti-Western hysteria. It's all part of their twisted narrative, one that tries to sell Russia as both the victim and an unstoppable force to be reckoned with.
Ядерной державы, это, по сути дела, война, на которую мы можем действительно сейчас уже юридически, если это будет утверждено, внесено в изменение указа, то есть утверждена новая доктрина, мы юридически можем это делать. Вторая вещь, это тоже важный момент, это закрыть нашего союзника, дать понять товарищам, главное, из Польши, гражданам Польши, что мы рассматриваем Белоруссию как собственную, безопасность Белоруссии как свою собственную. И если они двинут, то извините, Польши может и не быть.
Here is the deal. Ukraine, while not a NATO country, has received lots of Western gear and other support, including intelligence, which helped it whittle down Russia's so-called world's second-best army until it is struggling to catch its breath, apparently. The idea that a showdown with NATO might give Russia better results is, well, let's just say not very realistic. NATO, after all, isn't the CSTO, Russia's own paper tiger alliance, whose biggest claim to fame was either intervening inside its own member states or not reacting at all. Given Russia likes projecting its own fallacies upon others, I suppose they might think Poland would end up stranded like Armenia did when Russia ignored their pleas for aid. But guess what? Not going to happen. Right. Let's talk about Shaman. No, not the QAnon shaman of the Capitol Hill riots fame, or perhaps infamy, just Shaman. Not a nice guy either, mind, for he is a Putin-loving, war-supporting Russian pop star who also happens to be a bit of a hypocrite. Check this out. He justifies his love for Western gadgets, those evil, decadent symbols of the West, by saying their creators were probably inspired by Tchaikovsky and Dostoyevsky. Of course, how could we not see the connection? Every time Steve Jobs designed an iPhone, he must have been channeling something like Swan Lake, right? Well, following that brilliant logic, here is a fun thought. Let's tell the Russians that Western long-range weapons were also inspired by their cultural icons. Maybe the engineers behind HIMARS were listening to the Nutcracker when they were perfecting those precision strike capabilities. So naturally, it is completely fine to use them deep inside Russia because, you know, Dostoevsky's crime and punishment vibes. Yeah.
Мне предъявляют некоторые мои недоброжелатели о том, что ну как же, он же русский, а что же у него там, это там не знаю, там телефон американский, там машина немецкая или там еще что-нибудь, ну и вот в таком вот ключе, в духе. А я отвечаю, я понимаю, что очень просто. Мы же ведь не знаем, а может быть создатели этих американских телефонов, создатели этих технологий, или создатели этих автомобилей, или создатели чего-то. А может быть они вдохновлялись произведениями там Петра Ильича Тчайковского, когда они создавали этот телефон. Или там произведениями там Достоевского или Булгакова, которые по всему миру известны. Может быть, тогда бы без этих произведений вообще этих технологий не было и этих телефонов не было. Попробуйте просто подумать об этом. Мы же не знаем, как это было и чем люди вдохновлялись.
See, it all makes sense if you just throw in some Russian literature and a good helping of propaganda. Speaking of Russian culture, we would absolutely, unironically, love to see Swan Lake playing on loop on Russian TV. Those with at least a passing familiarity with Soviet history will understand the connection, and I suppose more than a few Russians would enjoy this too, a soundtrack for the end of an era. And with this, we conclude this episode of Break the Fake. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates.